What's up, everybody? If you are blessed by this content and you want to support the gospel's proclamation to the cults while equipping the church to combat deception, then come join us and become a Cultish all-access member. You will get an ad-free experience and exclusive content like Cultish the Water Cooler, where you hang out with Jeremiah and myself as we go live and interact with all of our members. You'll also get early release of episodes 1 to 2 weeks early. On top of all of that, there's also Cultish the Aftermath. It's an after-show commentary where we get to say all of the things that they won't let us. On top of that, you get all of the other training on apologiastudios.com. Come, be one of us. Head over to thecultishtshow.com or follow the link in the show notes and click the join button. Directly support the work of this ministry as the mission is completely funded by you, our listener.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Cultish, Entering the Kingdom of the Cults. My name is Jeremiah Roberts, one of the co-hosts here. As always, I'm joined with my trusty co-host and super sleuth, Andrew. It's good to this is our first recording in 2024. It's been a while since we've actually done something together. It feels like it was actually last time was in Utah with Haunted Cosmos. I was trying to backtrack, but it's good to be doing something with you again in a new year.
I know, dude, and we're kicking this year off with a boom with recordings. We're going to be talking about Islam today. That's huge, man. And I missed your face, Jerry.
Yes, and it's good to see your digital face over in your super secret headquarters. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guests today. This is going to be like an extended series. So when people are wondering, they might be wondering too, when all of a sudden like part 5 or 6 gets dropped, or we're wearing the same clothes. It's not that we haven't like changed our clothes over a couple of days or over an insurmountable amount of time. It's like we're recording this all in one bunch. So
I wouldn't have changed my clothes, but thanks for letting people think that.
Oh yeah. But anyway, it's good to have you back, man. Have you here, not back. Well, here, and you are from Seattle. You made it down here. Just tell everyone a little bit about you, and you've got a YouTube channel. Like, just tell them a little about yourself and what kind of makes you interested about the topic of Islam.
Yeah, so I'm originally from England, and I moved to Seattle in 2011 to intern for Mars Hill Church before that exploded.
Oh,
but there I met my wife, and then have stuck around there ever since. And basically, after I moved to Seattle, I got a job working for Subsplash, which makes the Apologia app. Actually, I was the one who sold you guys your app back in the day.
Oh wow.
And helped Luke set it up. It was good times. But I liked working for Subsplash, but I found myself living in a bit of a Christian bubble. And all my friends were Mars Hill people, and that was kind of it. And that's not how I grew up, because England is kind of like aggressively secular, especially the high school I went to.
Yeah.
Like there were, maybe 4 or 5 other Christians in my year at school, but for the most part, my life was a lot of difficult questions, and it shaped me in a lot of ways to be, effective in answering objections to Christianity and being able to explain Christian ideas to people who thought they were crazy.
Yeah.
And I just kind of gained this, conviction that I wanted to get out of my bubble more and meet more non-believers and, interact with some other ideas more. So the first thing I actually did was I listened through the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price on audio. Because I'd run into Mormon missionaries in England as well.
Yeah.
And I was listening to some of your guys' content back then too, and I thought, that seems like fun. I should learn that. And then once I was done with that, it was the perfect thing to listen to while you're working, because it's not like it's like massively engaging most of the time. No offense, Mormons, but but there's occasionally some parts you kind of like, take note of, but it's much less distracting than like listening to songs for me, because I'm listening to songs every 5 minutes. I'm trying to like find skip. Okay, this one.
Yeah.
So 5 minutes of work, 5 minutes of song searching, right? And once I was done with that, I decided to jump into the Islamic source materials. So, read through the Quran. I listened through Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, which are the 2 largest, what's known as hadith volumes. A hadith is like an encyclopedia of everything Mohammed said and did, categorized into topics, and then became convicted it was a very academic exercise. I didn't know any Muslims in Seattle, so in 2012, I started attending the Muslim Student Association at the University of Washington. I walked in super awkwardly, partway through one of the meetings. Everybody saw me come in. One guy waved me over, offered me a seat, invited me back, and I just kind of kept going back. And like kept learning about Islam and learning all this, information about Islam and making Muslim friends, and just got to kind of appreciate them as people, but also learn more about their theology and the way they think, and how to communicate effectively, and figuring out how Christians misunderstand Islam and Muslims, but also understanding how Muslims ultimately don't understand Christianity either, and trying to clarify both of those things. I want to make so I started the Al-Maida initiative as a way to get Christians and Muslims together over food, and from a Christian worldview perspective, we should be accurately representing the ideas of the people we disagree with. And so we want a friendly, honest conversation about Christianity and Islam. And the neat thing about it is Muslims have a concept of the sovereignty of God. So basically all of our events sort of start with an idea of like, look, everything we're talking about is bigger than us. And somebody might ask me, well, you want me to become Christian, right? I'm like, well, of course I do. I believe that God is offering you eternal life and forgiveness of all your sins for free through the sacrifice of Jesus. If I'm your friend, how can I not want that for you?
Right.
But here's the deal. I am not God. I'm not in charge of people's hearts and minds. God is. So my job is to speak the truth in love, to be hospitable to you. And if you believe, and if Muslims believe basically that same thing, that allows us to sit down and have a friendly and honest conversation and still go home as friends at the end of the evening, because we're not trying to, control everybody.
Right.
So the organization I run is called the Al-Maida Initiative. Probably put that in the comments because it's not intuitive to spell, because it's an Arabic word that means a table for the food and conversation.
We'll have links in our podcast too, so people can find you.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
So we what we do is we train churches, help them understand what Islam is as a worldview and who Muslims are as people, and kind of teach people how to build effective friendship and communication.
Right. And so what's important, what I want to really emphasize is that, your experience, your cumulative knowledge of Islam is not just taking a bunch of academic knowledge and sort of living in an echo chamber, and now we're just sort of like talking about it sort of without really having ever talked to someone who's Muslim. Like, this is something that from scratch really came about as just really dialoguing day in and day out, or just week in, week out, with different people in your area, in your community. So like how often would you say, like, how many, do you have like a count of like how many hours you think you've put in just like of like dialogue specifically back and forth with Muslims? Like, how much time have you think you've given to that?
Oh, I have like no idea, but I've been having long conversations with Muslims for like 12 years at this point.
Yeah.
So I've put a lot of hours into this. I've talked to a lot of different people from a lot of different countries. And I've had a ton of fun doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super admirable. I just think it's something, if you're going to be critiquing a worldview, you got to be willing to get into the lion's den with those, in a gracious sort of way, with those who are adhere to that. So, Andrew, just real quickly, just what are your thoughts initially when it comes to Islam, or just sort of like the first question maybe you have for James as far as how he got into this? What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I was just thinking, you said you've had a lot of conversations with Muslims. Do you have like a YouTube channel or anywhere that people can go to check those conversations out?
Yeah, I do. So we're the Al-Maida Initiative on YouTube. You can search for the Al-Maida Initiative, or you can search for my name, James Rayment, and you'll find us, or go to the link in the comments. And we have a couple of different types of content on our channel. Some of the questions that Muslims ask us and we answer. But then we have Muslims and Muslim leaders from different types on the channel specifically. So we never wanted to make content which is just talking about Islam. We want to talk to Muslims directly and kind of show people the kinds of conversations we want to have. And so there's a lot of very, very diverse perspectives on that. So if I have any Muslim listeners who object to anything I say in this podcast, which I'm sure I will, my invitation would be to come join me on the podcast and have a conversation about it. You can go look at what we've done. We always have friendly, honest, respectful conversations, and some of the episodes are good. Some need some work, but there's all sorts of people. We've got kind of hardcore, more Salafi type Muslims. 2 days ago, I just interviewed a sort of Sufi Muslim, which is a much more sort of like liberal and spiritual type of Islam. and we have friendly, honest conversations with people from all types of perspectives, and yours would be welcome too.
Awesome. And then,
So
go ahead.
yeah, so when we're thinking about Islam, I know specifically for me, it's like, where do we begin, right? Like, so if you're getting into a conversation with Muslim, where do you kind of start foundationally, and then where can we start as Christians to begin to even understand Islam?
So when I'm first meeting a person, what I'm trying to figure out is where they get their information about Islam from, because there's very different ideas within the Islamic world, and my advice to any Christian talking to any Muslim or anybody talking to anybody is you want to figure out the specific worldview of the person you were speaking to, not assuming that they kind of belong to some sort of greater subset. If you do that, there's not much that can go wrong in a conversation. But my initial work with anybody is just trying to figure out what is the worldview of the person I am speaking to. How do they individually think about the world? And while knowing about Islam can give you some good clues on where to start, it doesn't provide all the answers of the individual you're speaking with most of the time.
No, I definitely that's good. That definitely makes sense. Well, what if we do this? Maybe like zoom out a little bit. So you're talking about interactions with Muslims, and so maybe give a broader context too. Because this would be maybe this will help too. Because I mean, everyone is in a different part of the world or different part of the country, the United States, and they're gonna have someone in their proximity who's Muslim. So in your proximity, you're from Seattle. We talked a little bit before the podcast yesterday, and we talked a little bit over the phone. Like maybe explain to the context of Seattle, the relationship between Muslims, immigrants, especially when it comes to Seattle, and sort of like how you sort of use that to your advantage.
Yeah, so in Seattle, when I started, we had about 150,000 Muslims. There's about 200,000 now because we got about 50,000 Afghan refugees after the fall of Kabul. Not like directly resettled to Seattle, but it just more people have kind of moved and come up from Brazil. So basically, the average Muslim in America feels like an outsider to some extent. They feel like the rest of society is suspicious of them as an individual. Mm-hmm. So if we as Christians show up just in the ways we're supposed to show up, right, which is, loving the foreigner in us as Deuteronomy teaches, or, showing hospitality to strangers as Hebrews teaches us, then we just immediately gain credibility and good relationship if we are willing to see them as an individual, not as some scary collective, which is exactly how the Bible wants us to see people, right?
Right.
As individual image bearers of God. So if we just look at Muslims that way, if we're courageous and not afraid, which again is not an option for Christians, courage is the only way we're invited to live. So we engage people in that way, we just immediately have credibility. So in the West and in Arizona too, from my few days here, like on my way to Apologia yesterday, I met 3 Omani guys in a coffee shop. People come to the US from all over the world, and that, Christians spend, millions of dollars trying to get Christians to these kind of, obscure places a long way away, when all those people are coming here. And I'm not saying we shouldn't send people to other countries,
right?
But there's an amazing opportunity to show hospitality here and, engage people here. And by doing that, it's easier in some ways, because one big part about most other religions, whether it's Catholicism, Mormonism, and Islam as well, is that the group plays a massive impact in people's lives.
Yeah.
And people are terrified of what the group is going to say.
Right.
And so if they feel like everybody's watching, they can't be themselves. But when they feel like they're away from the group, they can be themselves. And when that happens, you can really make a connection with somebody and learn what they actually think about the world, rather than what they think they are supposed to say when they meet you.
Interesting. Andrew, what about you? Do you, like all your time in Utah, like have you noticed like mosque or just sort of like Middle Eastern Muslim couples there? Like what's been your observation up in Utah?
I've only seen a handful of Muslim people and only one mosque out here, which is kind of interesting. But being that it's like kind of like the Mormon Mecca out here, it's not surprising that the majority of people would be Mormon, even though that's changing. There's about to be actually in Salt Lake County more liberals than there are actually Mormons out here. But yeah, I haven't seen too many to have interactions with. Never on evangelism have I seen one out by BYU to interact with.
No, interesting. So what we're going to do is that, this is going to be an extended series. I'm really excited to unravel this. And there's so many layers to this, but I think one of the things that's important too is that when you look at even the foundations of like how to start a dialogue with someone who's Muslim, or even understanding the Quran, not even understanding it, how they view it, it does feel initially like overwhelming. Like I was skimming through, our pastor and elder, one of our pastors and elder, James White, he has a book, Whatever Christian Needs to Know About the Quran. I was skimming over that, and even just that, I was like, man, this is really good, but I feel like this is just heavy, rich, like thick. Like is there a way to kind of decipher this? Even that, from my perspective, just starting at the very beginning felt a little overwhelming. So I'm really excited to understand how to break that apart in bite-sized pieces. But what we're going to do is that we're going to start really at the very beginning. So honestly, historically, the only thing like of the origins I really know is the story of him going into a cave and getting this like vision or private revelation. But there's a lot more to it than that, I'm sure.
Right.
What's the focal like starting point from all your studies? Like what's the origin story that you can bring our audience into?
Well, once upon a time, there was a man and a woman in a garden. No, so what you have to understand, in Arabia in 570, which is the year Muhammad was born, or around that time, Arabia is kind of like the Wild West of the ancient Near East. So you have, on the one hand, the Sassanid Persian Empire, which is very powerful, and then you've got the Byzantine Empire, which would have called themselves the Roman Empire at the time. We called them the Byzantines.
Yeah.
And they're kind of constantly at war with each other. But Byzantine has a sort of very strong state Christianity at this time. And Arabia has no centralized government, and the government is all kind of tribally run. So that tribe represents kind of your religion, it represents your police, it represents your military, it represents your like social security net as well. So you have these massive tribal kind of conflicts between each other. So if you are in Arabia and you're part of a prominent tribe, your life is pretty good. Mm-hmm. If you're not part of one of these prominent tribes, you can be in kind of constant danger. But what that allowed for is the Byzantines would persecute Christian heretics. So think about Gnostics, you think about, or whatever heretical group you can think of that wasn't allowed in the Byzantine Empire, they would often sort of drift down into Arabia. Also, when the Romans took over Judea and destroyed the temple in AD 70, a lot of Jews migrated down to Arabia as well, away from the watchful eyes of the empire. So the religious milieu that Muhammad came into was a mixture of this overriding Arab polytheism, propped up by the tribal system, Judaism, and mostly heretical sects of Christianity. And you can see this in the Quran just by the ideas it's reacting to. And the difficult thing about this is basically pre-Islamic Arabia is not massively literate, which means most of the history of the region comes from the Muslim perspective, 200-300 years after the fact. But one thing you do see in the things that the Quran cites and references, you do get an idea of the religious, worldview of the day and the things it's referencing. And there's some Gnostic sources that are clearly referenced there about Jesus. There's some Jewish sources that are very clearly referenced. And we kind of construct the Arab polytheistic paganism from the Islamic accounts of it to some extent.
No, that's super interesting. So really what you're seeing, just a lot of syncretism like at that time. Like there's other religious leaders that you can see, when they start, you think about Joseph Smith, there's actually a lot of people who have sort of made parallels between the both of them, where, Joseph Smith took a lot of the ideas at his time in the 1800s, things that were going on in Palmyra, New York, and he really blended those together. Andrew, did anything come to mind when with what he mentioned?
Oh, for sure. Like, I know something which we'll probably get into later is a lot of people will argue for the divine inspiration of the Quran through the fact that there's no way Muhammad could have possibly have written it. They do the same arguments for Joseph Smith, right? He was illiterate. There's no way he could have written it. The argument of divine literary excellence, I think, is what it's called.
Yep.
A deep, dark figure overshadowed them, overpowered them. Interesting things like that. But I want to go back into this history real quick, James. So when we're thinking about the history, thinking about Muhammad, how do we know where this history comes from, and how can we compare it to the Gospels? Right. From some of my research, I learned a little bit about the Hadiths, and I can't even say this other one, but the Sirah. There's two different historical accounts. Can you define both of those for us? And then also when they were kind of compiled, like what year, how far after Muhammad's life was it? And then kind of compare that to the Gospels by like what we know about Jesus as well.
Yeah. So the Hadith are compiled, the first, as far as the major Sunni Hadith that we have now, they're compiled between like 225 to 300 years after Muhammad. And then the Sirat literature, like the earliest being Ibn Ishaq, which is, we don't have the original of that. We have a guy called Ibn Hisham, and I believe that's about, 150 years after Muhammad. It's in that ballpark. And a lot of people today are kind of making the argument that, well, because of this, Muhammad didn't exist. And the way they're getting there is they're taking this sort of higher critical methodology that the German scholars invented in the 1800s and are kind of applying it to this, right? The things we believe in are the things we can find hard archaeological evidence for. But as Christians, I think we have to realize that that's actually not like a useful way to look at the world altogether. There's useful things we can learn from it. But like asking a Muslim to prove that Muhammad existed is like me asking you to prove that your grandfather existed. Right? Like, well, if your grandfather really existed, produce me a letter in his handwriting, produce me like something he wore. And it's just like, you'd be scrambling to do that because it's just something you've never even like questioned in your life.
Right.
So so when skeptics started asking questions about the Bible, that Christians were caught flat-footed because no one thought, okay, we have to prove this with some sort of archaeological, evidence.
Yeah.
The closest would come, we're having to prove the genuineness of a relic in the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm.
But once people start asking these questions, people start looking for the evidence and they start finding the evidence. And I honestly, I think it's a little ridiculous to kind of think that Muhammad could be like made up. And let me give you a kind of equivalent example of this, right? So the earliest biography of Muhammad, when it's like written and us, and us now, right, would be the difference between us and the First World War. So just for context here, like let's say you don't trust the sources. Okay, that's fair enough. There's some reasons not to trust the sources, and they have a particular bias to them. But like there's this guy online called, the people kind of keep telling stories about this guy called Carton Duwiart who has this, eye patch. And, fought in all these battles and afterwards says, frankly, I enjoyed the war, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you wanted to tell me that he's just made up for the internet, I don't think that's true, but that's actually pretty plausible to me, right? You can invent some heroes as history kind of, drifts on. But could you invent Woodrow Wilson or could you invent Lenin? No, you couldn't do that.
Right.
Because there's still, like, so for me, right, you couldn't invent World War I because my great-grandfather went to Jerusalem in World War I and talked about his war experiences to my father. Right. And that happens on a kind of like a large enough level that people just kind of like intuitively understand these things. So I think there's all sorts of ways that you can allege that the Islamic sources are, have some unreliability in them. because they're not written by eyewitnesses. They're passed down orally for a long time. But to make them up, whole cloth, I think is a little bit of is a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And it's very popular right now. And I don't think it's massively helpful to be on that track.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of guys that I respect and have learned things from that believe that. I don't believe it. I think history will vindicate my position here.
Oh, interesting. And speaking of history, like you explained just a little bit of sort of like the syncretistic, there's a lot of syncretism with where he grew up. But did Muhammad, did he grow up as with sort of like a religious bias or prejudice, or what? Was there maybe a similarity? And again, I'm just doing a comparison with what I do know with Joseph Smith. Like part of his story, of his origin story, is that he looked around and saw all the different revivals going on. He wanted to know which church was true. So he went out into the woods to pray and see which church he should join. That's where Heavenly Father and Jesus come down in separate form. Was there a part of him wanting to figure out what was true amongst all the syncretism and trying to really find his footing? Is that how he kind of came about?
Yeah.
What was it like? What was his perspective from what you know?
Yeah. So again, the only perspective we have on this is the one that comes to us from the Islamic sources.
Right.
But it's almost exactly the same, actually. So Muslims claim that Muhammad was a monotheist even before he was a prophet, that he just kind of instinctively believed in one God, and nothing quite made sense to him. Mm-hmm. So he was, then he went out to pray in a cave, and as he's praying in the cave, trying to seek direction, that's when the angel Gabriel appeared to him and says, "Recite." Mm-hmm. And he says, "I don't know how." Then the angel squeezes him so tight that he feels like he's going to die. And then he says, "Recite," and then lets him go. He can't do it. Squeeze him again. Then the third time he starts to recite the words of the Quran. And initially this experience, according to, Sahih al-Bukhari and the Muslim sources, freaks Muhammad out. And he goes back to his wife, Khadija. And so Khadija is this, she's 20 years older than him. She's a very successful woman. And she proposes to him, actually, and he marries her. And, he also works for her and goes up to Syria trading things. But she's the one who calms him down, comforts him, and according to the sources, calls her uncle Waraka, who is a Christian priest. And Khadija and Waraka basically explain to Muhammad that, no, don't be freaked out by this. The angel is a true messenger from God. You're not possessed by a jinn. Jinn is a genie, by the way. It's a big part of Arabian folklore, and that God has called you to this work. So it's his wife Khadija and her uncle, the Christian priest, that convince him to kind of go on with the work and start teaching this to everybody. A
Christian priest inspires that, tells him to go, pursue this vision.
Yeah.
Wow. And so also just to clarify too, so there's a distinction from our understanding between how Muslims view inspiration, how Christians view inspiration, where we see, like Paul is penning a letter that's under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, but it's like Paul's the one who's authoring it. Where in this instance, that Muhammad is receiving this info from Gabriel, the angel, and so the Quran really isn't Muhammad's word; it's supposed to be really Gabriel speaking through Muhammad. Or what's the distinction between Islam's or Christian inspiration when it comes to that?
No, that's entirely correct. So a Muslim would say, in no sense is the Quran the words of Muhammad.
Right.
It's straight up dictation. The angel says something to him, he puts it down exactly.
Okay.
Now, in the Hadith, there is a category of things called Hadith Qudsi, which are revelations from Allah in the words of Muhammad. Mm-hmm. But the Quran itself is not considered the word of Muhammad in any sense. Whereas if you look at the way Jesus talks about the Torah, he interchangeably uses Moses said, God said. The words of Moses, the words of God, right? The words of Moses and God are the same, without Moses being God, right?
Right.
So the scriptures are, men are carried along by the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And they're the exact words of God, but they're also the words of the individual in a way there's no error.
Okay.
And that's how Christians understand this versus how Muslims understand this.
Yeah, and so just to recap then, so Muhammad has the initial encounter with the angel Gabriel. There's sort of 3 times where the Gabriel tells him to recite, but he doesn't really necessarily take down anything. He goes and then talks to his wife and the priests about it, and then he comes back and then has like the second encounter. Is that how I understand it?
So he basically he'll get revelations in different ways. So the claim is not always that he sees the angel every time. In Sahih al-Bukhari, he describes it and he says, sometimes it's like the ringing of a bell. Sometimes it sort of comes to me, and other times I speak with the angel Gabriel like a man. So it kind of comes to him in different times in different ways, piece by piece. Mm-hmm. Like the Quran is not a narrative.
Right.
It comes in pieces addressing various situations, and even like an entire chapter is not necessarily like revealed all at the same time. It kind of comes in chunks.
And so what's the time lapse between when he had the initial encounter, when he talked to his wife and the priest, and like over the time in which all the Quran was penned down?
So that is going to be about 20 years. But the Quran is not actually written down in one place in his lifetime. In Muhammad's time, the Quran is simply, an oral recitation, because that's the kind of culture he's in, right?
Okay.
People don't tend to write things down. They tend to have good memories and recite things. Mm-hmm. And that's why, as you hear the Quran recited in Arabic, it has a cadence to it, because it's made to be memorized and recited.
No, fascinating. And so really you have over his entire lifetime where it's sort of accumulating and sort of coming together. And it's an oral tradition. But then what he's known for is really, at least what comes to mind with Muhammad and the growth of Islam is conquest and advancement. So from a political standpoint, I mean, he's going and he had this initial encounter. How did that transfer from him sort of really being, I guess you call like a political leader, or just really creating the movement of his time? Like, what did that look like? Yeah.
So for the first few years, so I think it's 605, he has the first revelation, and then, and then so he's in Mecca for a period where he's just sort of going around telling everybody, look, there's not lots of gods, there's only one God. And this actually brings a lot of persecution. And the reason it brings persecution is because Mecca is the center of something called the Hajj, which is this pilgrimage that everyone in Arabia makes to offer sacrifices to their gods. So that exists in Islam today in honor of the one God, but at the time of Muhammad, it was done in a sort of polytheistic way, right? In their view, the pre-Muslim Arabs believed in Allah, like meaning the God, but also believed in all these sort of associate gods with him. Mm-hmm. And so as they would come from their different, parts of Arabia, Muhammad would come and say, this is silly, there's not lots of gods, there's only one God here. And he had a small number of converts, right? His daughters believed in him, his nephew Ali believed in him. But the tribal leaders of Mecca didn't like what he was doing, because they saw him as a threat to their way of life. So the two main opponents is a guy called Abu Jahl and a guy called Abu Sufyan, who are kind of conspiring against him, but can't really do anything because his uncle, Abu Talib, is another one of the tribal leaders. And Abu Talib never becomes a Muslim, but he holds Muhammad in high esteem and basically gives him protection. And his wife Khadija is super well connected as well. So basically, what happens to the early Muslims is that Muhammad himself is, for the most part, left alone, but his followers are kind of beaten, they're threatened, one is buried alive and killed, and eventually some of them even have to flee to Abyssinia, or modern day Ethiopia, where they receive asylum from the Christian king there, who refuses to let them be persecuted there. So in the middle of this, as people come in with these caravans, there's a city called Yathrib, which is now known as Medina, which has about half Jewish population and a half sort of pagan Arab population. And according to Ibn Ishaq and the earlier sources, what happens here is, and just a real caveat on Ibn Ishaq as a source, lots of Muslims don't really like it. but there really isn't much of an alternative for the history of this era.
Mm-hmm.
And all the people they do like Ibn Kathir and people they consider reliable, rely pretty heavily on Ibn Ishaq as a source, right? There's no getting around it. So it's the kind of version we have. But the idea is that these the Jews in Yathrib, Medina, have been telling the Arabs that a new prophet's going to rise. And when this new prophet arises, the Jews are going to rule over the Arabs.
Mm-hmm.
And that when people from this tribe meet Muhammad and he says, I'm a prophet that God has put here to point to the oneness of God, they basically say, well, our time is coming if the Jews embrace this guy. But if we embrace this guy first, then we can be the ones to subjugate the Jews.
Mm.
So they say, we will follow you, and we want you to come live with us in Medina. And the reason it's called Medina is short for Medina al-Nabi, meaning the city of the prophet.
Mm-hmm.
So in 622, they invite him. So his protection has died, right? Abu Talib, his uncle, and Khadijah die in the same year, and he's in trouble now.
Muhammad is
in trouble
Okay.
because his protection is gone.
Right.
And so he goes, so these people say, we'll follow you. But then Muhammad claims, Allah speaks to him and makes a new condition on them being his followers.
Mm-hmm.
Not only do they have to listen to what he says about God, but they have to swear allegiance to fight for him as well. So up until this point, Muhammad has had no political power, and in a lot of ways lives a life that a Christian could, respect and agree with. He's almost the model Christian up to this point, because he's teaching that there's one God, not lots of gods. He is a one-woman man, and he is he's using persuasion, not coercion, and he's suffering persecution patiently, right? And then the Hijra comes, and the Hijra is this means migration. So the migration from Mecca to Medina, and then he becomes the supreme leader of religion and state at this point. And so after Khadijah has died, a woman comes to him and says, "Hey, are you planning to remarry?" And he says, "Who would I marry?" And she says, "Well, what do you want? Do you want a widow or a virgin?" And he says, "Yes." And ends up marrying two women at the same time. One is a widow named Sauda. And when I say widow, don't imagine only like 24, right?
Yeah.
And then a virgin who's never been with a man called Aisha, the daughter of his best friend Abu Bakr. And so from that point, he starts being a polygamist, and eventually has 9 to 13 wives and several concubines, depending on which source you believe.
Mm-hmm.
So how far is Medina from Mecca?
I actually don't know. I've never driven it, so I would guess it's about 3 to 5 days journey on foot or camel. It's probably about probably about 3 hours drive. It's
Okay.
there's not.
Yeah, I'm just wondering because I'm thinking because doesn't he get into a series of battles and conflicts between like caravans coming from Mecca to Medina? How exactly did he gain power in Medina?
So basically, the whole premise of him going to Medina, he immediately has power, right? That's the kind of conditions he's put upon joining them. But at this point, all the Muslims are poor refugees. They have suffered genuine persecution and they don't have any stuff anymore. So the Meccans have these trade caravans that go to Syria, and the Muslims will make raids on those trade caravans and take stuff from them as what they see as kind of recompense for what's been taken from them by the Meccans. So this leads the Meccans to decide, okay, we need to do something about this. We need to protect our shipping routes. So they send an army, and they basically fight 3 battles for 3 years. One is the Battle of Badr, where with inferior forces and equipment, the Muslims actually defeat the Meccans. The next year, they fight something called the Battle of Uhud, which the Muslims lose that battle, but not decisively. Muhammad is injured, but not killed. And then finally they come to Medina a year later and kind of attack the city, but the Muslims, with a guy called Salman the Persian, dig this trench and basically outmaneuver the Meccans and basically break the Meccan military power on that day. And at that point, the Muslims and the Meccans make a treaty called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. And what that is we're not going to attack each other, and we're free to basically just kind of like go and build our own influence around, Arabia. So for the next 3 years, Muhammad is sending out raiding parties, missionaries, armies, and building more and more influence over the Arabian Peninsula. And then the Meccans, one of the tribes associated with Mecca, attacks one of the tribes associated with the Muslims, and Muhammad sees this as cause for war. And in his habit here is when he has a military raid, he doesn't tell everyone where they're going. So he's gathering all these 10,000 people together, and they suddenly realize we're going to Mecca. So Muhammad in the night marches and surrounds Mecca, and the Meccans wake up to see these Muslim torches everywhere, and they think it's the end. But Muhammad is benevolent in this situation. He allows them to surrender peacefully, and only executes 5 to 12 people depending on the source, which again, 5 to 12 executions may sound a little barbaric for our day and age, but it's at the time it's a very benevolent conquest. So at that point, Muhammad is now the master of all Arabia.
What's up, everybody? It's the Super Sleuth here, letting you know that you can go to shopcultish.com and get all of our exclusive Cultish merch. There's the Bad Theology Hurts People shirt. Jerry wears it all the time. I wear it all the time. Sometimes we wear it at the same time without even trying to have that happen on the show. And we're just like, whoa, you're wearing the shirt? I'm wearing the shirt. You could wear the shirt too. Go to shopcultish.com today and get your exclusive Cultish merch. Talk to you later, guys.
Yeah. And so from this point,
so how does this, I was gonna say, how does this theology change during this time, like going from Mecca being kind of peaceful into Medina, and then there's a transfer? It seems like, here's a quote I have from the Ibn Ishaq, page 596. I don't know what version this is from, but you can tell me if I'm wrong in this or not. It says, this is from Mohammed, supposedly. It says, "Are you disturbed in mind because of the good things of this life, by which I win over a people that they may become Muslim, while I entrust you to your Islam?" So he's conquering, and he's saying we get these spoils from war, and is it bad that I'm winning over people by doing these types of things? Is when does this theology change from peaceful to being almost like this conquering type of man, saying follow me, and I will give you some spoils of war if you are Muslim?
Well, I'm not sure how conscientious the change is, other than the circumstances change, right? He's just not in the position to do that in Mecca because he has no state power, right? So he So he becomes the government in Medina. So he has to start thinking like a government. But the things that do develop in that time are really the sort of the Muslim idea of the state and Muslim society. So if Mecca is kind of like, okay, what is the nature of God? What is God like? What is eternity like? What is judgment like? What is truth? And then Medina is answering the question, how does this truth look when it's embodied in a society?
Yeah.
And what they're trying to do is they're trying to sort of subjugate all of society to the divine law of God. And that's when you have things like, the 5 daily prayers. That's where you have the sort of Muslim Friday services happen. And that's really where you start to get the theology of conflict in Islam as well. So this doctrine emerges that those who die in battle go straight to paradise without having to go through any of the usual judgments that happen. And so, all the Muslim armies that go out with this, mentality of victory or martyrdom. So it's very much similar to like how a Viking army would fight, that they're fighting almost with the hope to die in battle, because that's how they'll go straight to Valhalla. So you look at those kind of mindsets; they're very similar, and that develops in Medina and is a sort of powerful force. So, and then they have to ask, how do we do justice? How do we have a legal code, and how do we do that? And I think it's important for us to understand as Islam as Christians, that Islam does lots of things that are good in that society as well.
Yeah.
So for example, you can expose your female daughters and kill them if you don't want them, if they're too expensive to take care of in pre-Arabian society. We don't know how widespread that is, but the Quran addresses that directly and wants people to see baby girls as a gift from God and to take care of them and to provide for them. It wants to have a unified code of justice that applies to the powerful tribal leaders and the sort of average slave alike, which is a good thing, right?
Right.
So there's lots of good things that Muhammad believes in that are good things about Islamic law, mixed with some things that are unbiblical and harmful as well.
Right. When you talk about his upbringing, going into a society that was very syncretistic, as he went from just believing this is what God told him, seeking him out for that, and sort of being like an Abrahamic patriarch all by himself to all of a sudden amassing this sort of political, influence, just the way it was with his associations, and then when he took over Mecca, how did that affect his beliefs when it came to Islam and what he believed that Allah was telling him? Did that in any way evolve or progress? Because it seems like anybody who sort of gets that ring of power, per se, like that seems that would sort of affect or have influence on that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think what you see, because one of the things that happens is polygamy as well.
Right.
So Muhammad gets lots of wives at this time, and there are parts of the Quran which seem to very specifically enable him to do something specific for him. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Muhammad adopted a son named Zayd, and Zayd was married to a woman called Zainab, and Muhammad one day, goes over to Zayd's house and sees Zainab not wearing her hijab, and he turns around, refuses to look at her, and and Muslims will argue about the exact nature of this story, but the nature, the end result ends up kind of being the same. Mm-hmm. And so Zayd hears about this and is unhappy anyway, and so he divorces Zainab and says, "Oh, you should marry her now." And then after this, Zainab, Muhammad says, no, I can't do that. This is, socially unacceptable. But then a surah of the Quran comes down, Surah Al-Azhar, which is the 33rd one, which basically does a couple things. One, it abolishes adoption in Islam, meaning that you can't call an adopted son by your last name. And it also gives Muhammad explicit permission to marry Zainab. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how that, so you start to see things, like this.
Yeah.
And so he gets a lot of power. He gets a lot of, he gets a lot of women, and just kind of that kind of grows and grows and grows. And the Quran actually seems to, reflect that to some capacity. Yeah. As well.
And so when he's going, Andrew, was there something you had in your mind, or?
Oh no, I'm listening.
Yeah. So when it comes to this, this fasting, there's like a lot of like moving pieces, and so like in this whole process, when it comes like what, like up to the time of his when he saw the vision to the time of his death, like what was the year span? Like how old was he? Like what do the sources say how old he was when he had the initial vision, and how long did he live till?
He lived till he was like 64, I believe. Okay. I can actually do the math here. So he was born in 570, and he died in 632. Okay. I guess this is like 60 something, right? Right. And so his time in Medina is 10 years, and I believe the time in Mecca is about the same. So he's got about a sort of 20-year ministry. Yeah. First half in Mecca, second half in Medina.
Yeah, and so like in that whole process, like what took place like after his death? Was there some sort of separation or fragmentation of somebody like you, a vacuum of power, and sort of like someone wanting to sort of wield the political scepter at that point? And how did that affect, like, what parts of Islam was made prior to his death, and what came afterwards? You think about, the 5 pillars of Islam, the call to prayer, bowing towards Mecca, all those things that we view through modern Islam, and even like when your dialogues, like what's pre-Muhammad and what's post-Muhammad?
Well, that's a very, very complicated question.
Yeah.
Because everything that's formulated after Muhammad is going to sort of claim to be from, like, Muhammad, right? So the way the Sunnis formulate Islam, they're going to say this is the authentic Islam of Muhammad.
Yeah.
And the way Shias formulate Islam, they're going to say this is the authentic Islam of Muhammad.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as there's as far as like what's written down, the answer is nothing. Mm-hmm. Which makes this complicated. But the basic outline of what happens when he dies is he's talked about something called the caliphate. So the word caliph means successor, and caliphate means the word the realm of that successor, right? Yeah. A king rules over a kingdom, a caliph rules over a caliphate, right? That's how it works. So, but there's a lot of ambiguity into who he wanted to succeed him. So there's basically 3 people that believe they should be the successor of Muhammad. So one, and this is what Shias believe, is his nephew and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abu Talib. And so there's actually a time where Muhammad meets with a group of Christians who, basically want to sort of don't believe he's a prophet, and he wants their allegiance. And they spend 3 days arguing about whether Jesus is God or not. And Muhammad says, okay, we're going to have a curse off, basically, where he says, all right, you bring your family, your families, and I'll bring my family. And and then we'll see who God curses and who God blesses. And Muhammad brings his daughter, Fatima, and Ali, who's married to Fatima, and Hassan and Hussein, their sons, and he kind of covers them under his cloak and say, these are the people of my house, the Al-Bayt.
Yeah.
And then the Christians don't show up or decide, we don't want to do this game. And they basically make an agreement that they can live peacefully if they pay Muhammad tax money. So that's actually important to acknowledge just on the starter, is that there's always been space for Christians to live in the Muslim world to some extent. Like, Muhammad didn't kill Christians or force them to convert to Islam. He argued with them, but the society he built allowed them to live in it. So basically, from that instance and a few other things, they say Ali is my executor, obey him. Ali believed that Muhammad wanted him to be his successor. And it seems like this, if you read the literature, it seems like there's a bunch of times where Muhammad almost says that, but there's some ambiguity around it. So the Sunnis believe that the community as a whole is supposed to decide who the next leader is, and do that based on, Quran and, Hadith criteria. But there's a guy called Sa'd ibn Ubadah, who was one of the prominent tribal chiefs of Medina. And these were the first group of people to really commit to Muhammad. And so his argument is, look, we're the ones who, believed in you when you were a struggling artist trying to make it. We were the ones who supported you. And Sa'd ibn Ubadah believed that he should be the caliph because of their role in that. So he gets together all of the elders of Medina and starts saying, all right, I should be the caliph. You guys need to swear allegiance to me.
Yeah.
Then Muhammad's best friend and this guy called Omar, who is super zealous and super competent, basically crashed the meeting and what are you doing, guys?
Yeah.
And it's well, we're appointing a caliph. And Abu Bakr's no.
Yeah.
No, you're not. No one's going to follow you. The person they follow has to be from the Quraysh, which is the tribe Muhammad's from in Mecca. And then Sa'd ibn Ubadah says, okay, how about this? We'll do one caliph from the Quraysh and one caliph from the Ansar, the people of Medina. Abu Bakr says, no, they'll never follow you. There has to be one. There's one God. There has to be one leader.
Right.
So at that point, Abu Bakr nominates like two guys. One of them is Omar, and Omar says, I will not be the leader of a community of which Abu Bakr is a member. Holds up Abu Bakr's hand and says, I pledge allegiance to Abu Bakr. Then everyone starts doing that except Sa'd ibn Ubadah. And Sa'd ibn Ubadah, objects, but then Omar literally goes and like beats the guy up and like grabs him by the beard, knocks out some of his teeth. And then Sa'd ibn Ubadah kind of like fades into history at that point. And then one of the best places to read about all this, by the way, if you want a source, is the history of Al-Tabari. Again, Muslims don't, are not going to say, yeah, I believe every single thing that's in Al-Tabari, but there really isn't a great alternative to it either. If you want to learn these things, it's either Al-Tabari or it's a mystery. And Al-Tabari does cite his sources, and sometimes he'll put competing accounts in there. That something happened here, and there's lots of different attestations of this event. And then Ali, however, is not at this meeting. He is busy with the preparal of Muhammad's burial. So Omar goes over to Ali's house and says, come out here and swear allegiance to Abu Bakr as caliph, or I'm going to burn your house down. And Ali, is not happy about the situation, but eventually he pledges allegiance because Ali is a team player for sure. And that's how you kind of have the first, successor arise there. And that's the kind of, hasn't quite sprung up yet, but that's the, the sort of seeds of the Sunni Shia conflict.
No, it's fascinating. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I have a question going back to the taxes situation there, because in some of my research, I pulled up Surah 929. There's a translation of that. It says, fight those who do not believe in Allah nor in the latter day, nor do they prohibit what Allah and his apostle have prohibited, nor follow the religion of truth out of those who have been given the book, until they pay the tax in acknowledgement of superiority, and they are in a state of subjection. So what does it mean specifically to be a Christian submitting to Islam? Is it just that they pay taxes and they can preach Christianity? Or is it something different? I'm trying to understand Surah 929 with living in peace by just paying taxes.
Yeah, so this is one of the difficulties with interacting with the Quran, is it doesn't have its own context contained with it. What that's specifically referring to, though, from the history, is an instance where Muhammad marched an expedition up to the very north of Arabia, to Tabuk, with the intention of fighting the Byzantines. They weren't there, so that it didn't end up being a battle, but there was certainly a sort of conquest mindset against the Byzantines, right? So the people of the book, when he says that, he's talking about the Byzantine Empire. So he's talking about fighting their armies until they're, subjugated. What submission means has been a nebulous term through Islamic history. So sometimes it's meant, a pretty good deal. Equivalent to like Dubai in modern times. Like being a Christian in Dubai is fine. The government leaves you alone. There's solid churches there.
Yeah.
The government's not trying to, monitor what you say. But you also have something called the Pact of Omar, which people debate all the time whether it's a genuine document, but Muslims throughout history have believed it as a genuine document. And basically that imposes kind of crushing standards on Christians, right? So it says they're not allowed to build new churches. They're not allowed to repair existing ones as they fall apart. Christians are not allowed to work in the government. They're not allowed to ride horses in the same way that Muslims do. They're not allowed to teach. They're not allowed to do their kind of graphic design in the same way.
Yeah.
They're not allowed to if a Muslim asks to sleep in their church, they have to say yes, and they have to pay taxes as well, and they can't teach their children the Quran. They can't, share Christianity with Muslims, and so basically, what those laws are designed to do is to tolerate the Christians that are there, but to generally like phase them out over time, right? But a lot of later Muslim leaders liked having Christians and Jews in the empire because it meant more taxes.
Right.
So Muslim leaders were actually had an incentive structure to help Christian communities prosper because it meant more money for them. So, and if you talk to either of those sides, they're going to completely disagree about what Muhammad himself wanted, from this. Much more likely he wanted conversions.
Yeah.
But you have, because the Quran does not have context, people can kind of like construct that in several different ways. So at times it's been a good deal for Christians, at times been a very bad deal for Christians. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, dude, great answer, man. That helps clarify it for me.
Yeah,
too. Thank you.
Yeah, just one thing I want to do is, and again, we're kind of already. I feel like we're almost sort of in the first part of our episode. I feel like there's so much we can unravel. One thing I just want to comment, even as we're up this first portion, is talking about some of the history here, is that all of us sort of have our confirmation biases, like going into like this conversation about Islam. For me personally, my introduction to the world of Islam was September 11th. A couple days later, I remember seeing Osama bin Laden's face on the face of the Arizona Republic. And of course, you saw some Arabic going across the top of Al Jazeera, and even like there's even like words that you're utilizing that I feel like I have sort of confirmation bias, words that I was introduced to by way of the geopolitical world of the Bush administration in like the 9/11 era. So you just mentioned the caliph or the caliphate. My introduction to the word caliphate was this documentary that came out, basically as I think it was produced by Fox News. It was basically made to scare conservatives of Islam. Basically it's talking about how there's certain people of radical Islam that want to create Islamic caliphate to take over the entire world and subjugate every other person who won't submit to Islam to die by the sword. And so, and of course, and I was like, oh no, that's kind of scary. But even, there's aspects too. You're talking about how they'd work with Christians and Jews and they want to have more taxes. So you had a lot of, even after Muhammad had that political power, which we're going to talk about in future episodes, even like the Crusades. Like one of the biggest objections that comes up to like, why should I to Christianity is like, well, what about the Crusades? And so you have even like you have a lot of, I feel like there's a lot of confirmation bias that comes into this. So you really giving this holistic perspective, I think is very, very refreshing.
Yeah. So one thing that comes with that, right, is we are, tainted by the world we live in.
Yeah.
In this. So, for example, right, one thing that people do is they'll read these verses about kind of jihad and conquest and martyrdom, and they immediately think of somebody driving a truck through Paris or 9/11 or somebody with a suicide vest.
Right.
And the fact is that when these sources are written, there's no gunpowder. So gunpowder and that type of warfare is a later development from that. So to say, okay, well, the true Islam is the Islam of the terrorists is a little disingenuous, because everyone has had to work out how to work out Islam in the modern world. And people like Ayman al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden and the Taliban and ISIS work it out one way, but it's not the only way that people have worked that out. And just because you believe in, warfare in a strong state doesn't at all necessitate you believe in getting there through, blowing yourself up at some point and, crazy revolutions. Again, it's easy to see some of the straight lines from the Islamic sources to some of those things, and you can, it's worth debating and discussing and thinking carefully about.
Yeah.
But to kind of, typically what I think I did, and I think what most Christians have done when interacting with Muslims, is they think of Al-Qaeda as the conservative people who are serious about it. And you have, then you have nice Muslims, and they're nice because they don't take Islam seriously at all, basically. And it really is not that simple. There's lots of different conservative liberal spectrums in Islam, and they don't all lead to the same place.
Yeah. No, and that's fascinating. I feel like there's a whole lot more we could unravel. So what we're going to do is we are in other episodes. So this is really the first segment. This is sort of a very quick introduction to Islam, some of the historical aspects, timelines, seeing how it evolved, and something that's really a huge section. It pretty much encompasses like an entire, one full continent of the world, and just all other areas of the world as well too. Throughout different aspects, personal, geopolitical. It's something that's a part of our lives, one way or the other. So that being said, real quickly, remind people again where if they want to find more about your YouTube channel, the dialogues you've had with Muslims, the research, the content that you have, what's the home address? Where should people go to?
So you can search for us on YouTube. You can find us on almaidah.org. That's al-maidah.org. That has links to everything on it as well. Or you can just kind of Google my name, James Rayment, and you'll find us pretty quickly.
Excellent. We'll have links in the description too.
Oh, and by the way, that's Rayment.
Yes.
There's a guy that spells it Mond. No sense of humor.
Oh, I like that. All right. So we're going to go and wrap things up here. This is part 1. I hope you all enjoyed this, and definitely comment on your social media. Let us know your thoughts. And all that being said, we'll talk to you all in part 2 as we look into the world of engaging and understanding and answering Islam. Talk to you all soon.
Can't wait to get the next episode in the series? Then join the Cultish All Access. Get early release of these series to quench those binging desires along with a host of amazing perks. Head over to thecultishtshow.com or follow the link in the description and start listening to the full series while supporting this mission.